This morning, we're not going to have technical difficulties, I declare. So we have a lot of information to cover and not a lot of time. So I'm going to try to get through this as briefly as possible because I really want to hear from you all, questions that you may have, comments that you may have, things that have been coming up in conversations amongst you all or amongst your families or parents or with other folks here at the school. I do want to talk about a few things before I get started to just sort of like set some ground level for the conversation. So we will be talking about issues of sex and sexuality this morning. And so some of the information that I'm going to be talking about may be a little intense, may seem a little provocative to some of you. And please know that the intention is not to offend you or discuss subject matter that may be a little bit more mature than what you're used to. We really want to just educate you on some of the realities and some of the dynamics of these issues, which really are a part of our lives. That being said, this information may also be a little bit traumatic and trigger some very unpleasant memories or experiences for some of you. And to that I say, first take care of yourselves. So if you feel like something is stirring up, if you feel uncomfortable in any way, please seek out support from a friend that you trust or a staff or a faculty member. Even if you have to step out of the room for the entire presentation, please know that first I want you to take care of yourselves, and I want this space to be as safe and affirming and validating and empowering as possible for everyone in this room. Now for some of you, this information may be a little basic, like maybe you know a lot about these topics, you've studied, you've researched, you've heard a lot about on the news about these things. And for some of these things, it might be pretty introductory, right? It might be the first time that you're having this conversation. But again, what I encourage all of you to do, no matter where you are on that spectrum, is to continue the conversation when you leave this room today, amongst your friends, with your parents, with your family members, and with all the fantastic folks here at Sacred Heart that are here to support you. So the other thing that I'm going to ask, which I always do, is that information that is shared in this room stays in this room, that you respect your peers and your classmates, respect their right to have an opinion. We can all agree to disagree. This is a very highly contentious and controversial subject matter, and we don't often agree. Sometimes we have different viewpoints and opinions, and it's all valid. Again, the important things that we have the conversation. You're going to hear me say that a lot, because really having open, honest dialogues about issues related to sexual violence is where we get to the root of it and where we start to make sure that we're eliminated in our society. So without further ado, I want to take a moment and try to get us all on the same page this morning, and we're going to do just a brief visualization exercise. And so if everyone feels okay to close your eyes for a moment. And I want you to imagine the most intimate experience that you've ever had with another person. It could be a friendship, it could be a romance, or it could just be a deep emotional connection that you've had to someone. Friend, family member, romantic partner. I want you to think about how that made you feel, how that person made you feel. I want you to think about fond memories that you may have of that person that you might want to relive over and over and over again. Fun that you had together, secrets that you shared, moments that you shared, the joy that you felt when they were around. Think of the trust that you might have had for that person, or the assurance that you felt that you were safe and content when you were with them. And then think of how you would describe that experience to a friend so that they could understand how special it was to you and how it impacted you. Okay, everyone's holding on to that. Now you can open your eyes. And so no doubt for many of you, like I said, those were really fond memories that were really touching. Kind of give you like a warm, fuzzy feeling inside. Helps you to appreciate, to be grateful, to be able to have those relationships. But the opposite of that is if I asked you to imagine if those memories that you had of that other person weren't fun, if you had memories of someone that wasn't exciting, but instead maybe conjured up some of the worst times of your life. Having memories of someone that make you feel vulnerable, that make you feel confused or ashamed, or make you doubt everything about who you think that you are. Imagine how difficult it might be to relate a story like that to someone that you knew. friend, family member, an administrator, or even a law enforcement officer or an attorney or somebody that you don't know at all. So as much as that might be difficult for us to conjure up, because many of us have not had that experience, it is unfortunately far too common, the fear and discomfort that's experienced by people who are survivors of sexual violence. So I'm going to go through some definitions. Again, just a lot of times we talk about sexual assault, we talk about dating and domestic violence, we talk about stalking. And so sexual violence really shows us and really touches on the ways that all of these issues are interrelated. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. So sexual violence is an umbrella term to really talk about acts that are perpetuated against the will of another person based on intimate sexual contact. And so, like I said, it can include sexual assault, it can include sexual misconduct, dating and domestic violence, and stalking. And so we're going to talk about mostly today sexual assault and healthy relationships. We're also going to talk quite a bit about consent. And so I want to start off about talking about what is the California definition of sexual assault. And so the California definition under California law of sexual assault is non-consensual sexual intercourse. It involves coercion, the use or threat of force, violence, or immediate or unlawful bodily injury, and threats of future retaliation. So within this would entail any sort of like sexual or intimate act that's initiated without the consent of another person. And consent is quite simply permission. The law tells us that there needs to be clearly expressed enthusiastic consent from the other person. And the qualifications for whether or not something constitutes sexual assault is the same whether or not the initiator is a stranger, a loved one, a spouse, or a acquaintance or a friend. It's estimated that about 1 in 4 women and 1 in 6 men will be the victims of sexual assault in their lifetime. And most people know their attacker. Most people know the person who sexually assaults them. And this is by far in contrast to what we see in terms of how this is portrayed on TV a lot, right? Where we see the stranger who jumps out of the bushes, or a lot of stranger assaults are portrayed like in the media. And that's not to say that those types of things don't happen, they very much do. But 85% of the time, the person who assaults a victim is known to the victim, and often very closely related to the victim. And so we want to talk about this because, as you can imagine, this makes this issue all the more complex and all the more heart-wrenching and all the more difficult to address, because what we're talking about is the violation of trust. We're talking about the violation of relationships. We're talking about the violation of understandings that people think that they have between each other. And when someone breaks that trust by initiating an act of sexual assault, that's really devastating to the survivor. I should also say that I use the words victim and survivor interchangeably. It's just sort of what we do within this field, within this language. And really sort of, the victim is really seen as more so a legal term, and the term survivor is really used to denote that process of survival and recovery, and really empowering to let people know that this is possible, right? And with the right resources and with the right support, that recovery is possible. So much of the research that's done on sexual violence is very heteronormative. It makes a lot of distinctions based on male and female relationships with partners of the opposite sex. And this is really because most sexual assaults occur on this gender dynamic of male and female. So over 98% of sexual assaults, whether they're committed towards males or females, are committed by males. However, what we know is that there are very few men who commit sexual assault. So all the research tells us that there's a very, very teeny tiny population of men in our society who commit these acts multiple times. There's one researcher who estimates, based on campus sexual assaults, that an average repeat offender will perpetrate 6 times before they are caught or before they are reported. 6 times. And so when we think about this, it kind of brings to the point where a lot of men say that they feel like they're being attacked or they're being blamed or they're being looked at as potential offenders, when the research tells us that, again, it's a very small number of men and boys who are committing these acts multiple times. However, what we do know in terms of like how we're socialized is that there's a lot of lower level acts, right? A lot of sort of like practices and language and things that are acceptable. When we talk about like great culture, that also contributes to how prevalent these things are in our society. So, we also know that sexual assault can be perpetrated against anyone regardless of any sort of identity trait or their status. So regardless of gender, regardless of race or ethnicity, socioeconomic status, there are male survivors and there can also be female perpetrators. And sexual assault is also very pervasive in the LGBTQ populations. So it really crosses the gender and sexuality spectrum. And again, this is not something that we often hear talked about when we discuss these subjects, particularly in the media. So I'm going to show you guys a quick clip in a moment that talks about consent. And like I said before, basic definition of consent is permission. You must get permission from someone before attempting to engage in a sexual act with them, even if it's just kissing or touching. Simple as that. There are no exceptions to this rule, even if you feel like you are the nicest, most attractive, most awesomest person in the world, you very well may be. However, does not mean that someone wants to kiss or engage in any sort of physical activity with you. You can take your niceness and your awesomeness about your very little way, right? If that other person is not consenting. And there's really no way to tell if a person is giving you consent unless you ask, right? Unless it is verbal, unless there are very much understanding that are made, unless there's really relationship, right? And communication that is happening on an ongoing basis, it makes it really difficult to determine whether consent is there. And so I'm going to show you guys this clip. I think it's kind of corny in some parts, but I think she gives like a really good explanation of consent. There's also a couple of points where she gets a little explicit. And so again, not meaning to offend, but like I said, I think it's a really good relatable example of consent.
You know what's so deliciously hot to me? I'm with a person I like, and there's a little bit of sexual tension, and then we lean over and they're like, "Can I kiss you?" I don't make that sound. Usually. Why is it so sexy that they asked for consent if it was okay? Which shows one, that they respect me, and two, that they've got some basic sexual communication down. Hot. But consent isn't just hot, it's also mandatory. Sexual contact without consent is assault or rape. Here's the thing, people often think of sexual coercion as something that's, violent or physically restraining. In reality, sexual coercion is often much more subtle. It happens between two people who know and maybe even trust each other. The perpetrator will use pressure, manipulation, drugs, alcohol, and force to initiate sexual contact without permission. Worse, in the real world, sexual coercion is often seen as acceptable. Like pushing someone over and over and over after they've said no, or throwing yourself on someone without warning because it's romantic. Oh, that shit's not romantic. It's just creepy and salty and rapey. So can people just, can you not do that? Are you enjoying yourself? How does that feel? Do you like that? Do you want me to keep going? How far do you want to go? You look uncomfortable. Are you okay? Good consent is basically just checking in. It's paying attention to someone's body language, how they're doing, keeping those lines of communication open so that everyone's on the same page and everyone feels safe and comfortable, which means this is not how you ask for consent. No, come on, I thought you liked me. I promise you'll like it. Just do it for me. What's the big deal? We've had sex before. I'm so horny right now. I'll like it last weekend. Douchebag alert! Also, potential rapist alert. Rapists often see sex as something that's owed to them. Sex is never something that's owed to someone. Doesn't matter if you've been flirting, if you hooked up before, if they bought you dinner, not even if you're naked. Pushing someone until they finally give in is not consent, because you're basically not giving the option to say no. So how can you know if someone is consenting once you ask? Yes, please. That feels so good. Keep going. We're done for anything in these areas, but not these areas. Yeah, right there. Why, yes, I would like that. Consent is a clear yes, it's enthusiastic. I want it. It's out loud, and there's no doubt in your mind. And remember, consent can always be rejected. So if you feel like the vibes are kind of changed, or you're unsure, getting mixed signals, you want to check in. This is what no might sound like. I don't like that. You stop. I'm not ready for this. Can we slow down for a second? I'm not into this anymore. I guess, if you want me to. Please don't. feel uncomfortable or guilty or not know how to say it. So that is why it's really important to hear that verbal out loud yes. And if they're being quiet, ask them, hey, how you doing? What's up? How's it going? Everything okay? And that video is basically, in a nutshell, is how you practice good consent. So now I want to talk about some situations where consent cannot happen, even with a verbal yes. Sometimes people get drunk. You may have learned this about the world. When it comes to sex, a little bit of alcohol isn't a big deal. But if they're too drunk to drive, they're too drunk to give consent. Period. Getting sexual with someone who's wasted, slurring their words, their body's limp, they can't communicate clearly, maybe they're throwing up, that's absolutely sexual assault. Let's all do the right thing and take care of them, not take advantage of them. Sometimes when I'm at schools, people ask me, well, what if they're both really, really drunk? Pretty simple. Sex is an active thing. It requires the intentional action of at least one party to get it done. Remember, sex isn't something that happens to someone. It's something that happens together. Both people participating. This kind of having sex with someone who's intoxicated or in this compromised state is against the law. You can be expelled and you can go to jail for it. Age of legal consent, it varies by state, it varies by country, but for an adult to have sex with a minor is statutory rape. And in general, when people are in two very different parts of their life, it raises some red flags. This ties into situation number 3. You hold authority over them. You can't get consent from someone who you have power over. So I'm talking about things like teachers and doctors, therapists, coaches, priests, caregivers, famous actors, maybe even famous YouTubers with their fans. When one party depends on the other, when they trust them, rely on them, when they idolize them, it severely impairs their ability to consent. Why? Power dynamics like these come with strong underlying vulnerabilities, which can give the appearance of consensual sex when it's actually exploitative. Someone abusing their power. We need to make open lines of communication and consent just a standard, normal part of sex. It's not a situation where most teenagers can't even describe what consent is. We do have the power to change it as individuals, and by spreading this information to other people, we can help to create something called consent culture. That's a culture where all the sex that is had is sex that is wanted, and that's how it should be. But that's not how it is. Give me all the consent. I'm ready. I love you all so much, and I will see you again next time. Mwah. Bye.
So like I said, it's a little bit hokey, I know, but I think that she touched on a lot of points that really get to the crux of what consent is and what it's not. And some of the things, like I said, were a little bit, corny, or may have seemed like a little bit unrealistic, but it really just highlights the need for conversation, the need for understanding, and really not just understanding our partners, but also understanding ourselves. And the choices that we need to make and how we can establish our own boundaries and have those conversations that need to be had to make sure that we have consent. And so the reason why I'm showing this is really to sort of demonstrate why this happens, right? And so people say why does sexual assault even exist in our society? Where does this come from? And so it's a much larger conversation than we can have this morning, but it really sort of results from gender discrimination, right? So when we think about language that we use, when we think about all the ways that people are discriminated against in society and all the differences in equality and rights and privileges that people receive, and so really what's at the crux of issues of sexual harassment, sexual assault, relationship abuse, is that power and control dynamic, right? That really relegates one person to not have power, to not have control over their own bodies, to not have agency over the choices and the decisions that they make, and then another person who decides that they're entitled to that. And that's really quite simply what it is. It's one person or group of people deciding that they are entitled to, that they have the right over, that they can have whatever they want, and the other person's opinions and thoughts and desires and rights over their own bodies, their own selves, their own individuality doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. I want what I want by all means possible, and I'm not really being considerate of you or your needs or wants, or you as an individual even. And so, in talking about that, we really need to examine what we want in relationships. One example that I use all the time in terms of questions that we can ask, especially when we talk about things like rape culture and victim blaming and how these things are condoned in our society. You guys may have heard those terms. quite a bit. And rape culture really just says when you have a society in which there are jokes on TV. I'm going to show you guys another clip of a show that often, I don't know if you guys watch It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. Have you guys seen that show? And they tend to have a lot of really sort of like explicit rape jokes. Like at one point, I watched the show maybe like a week in a row, and it was like every single night there was some portrayal of really like tacky rape jokes, right? And so when these things are pervasive, when these things are accepted, when these things are a normal part of our society or our culture, they really desensitize us, right? They desensitize us to the humanization of the people who are impacted by this, right? It basically tells us that it doesn't matter and that these things are okay. So when you hear things like rape culture, it's really sort of all the different ways that this is woven into our society, in our music, in our media, and all the different ways that this is portrayed that, like I said, desensitizes us and makes us think that this is normal behavior. And so instead of asking sort of like the questions that really condone and perpetuate that these things are okay, we need to be asking questions that say, how do I know that I'm ready to engage in a relationship? Because many people don't. I work at a university, and sort of like the common perception of a lot of folks is that sex, well, not that dating is rampant because universities have a reputation where no one dates, that people just sort of hook up a lot of times, but that sex is rampant on college campuses. And what we've learned through our research is that there are so many students who do not have sex, who are not even in relationships. They choose to focus on their academics, they choose to focus on their studies, there might be religious or cultural reasons, or they may have had sex before and they just choose to start practicing abstinence at that point. It really runs the entire spectrum, but we don't hear a lot from those students because everyone wants to talk about the students who aren't engaging, right, and who are making those choices. And so understanding that it's a choice, understanding that it's your right, and understanding that that's okay, no matter how long you might want to wait, no matter how much you may want to sort of like roll yourself in and out of those roles, it's okay. And also, what we encourage you to do is to talk to your friends about that. It might, seem awkward, or there might be peer pressure or social pressure to date or to have sex. But when you talk to your friends about the decisions that you've made and the boundaries that you've established, it helps you all to look after each other. It helps you all to take care of each other. It helps you to support each other in those decisions. And also to support each other in making the healthy and right decisions in terms of how you treat each other. Another thing that I wanted to talk about is really victim blaming. And again, we see this a lot because of the culture that says that, this is normalized and it's acceptable. So this was, So this was a poster from a demonstration and really talks about how we live in a society. We live in a just world society, right? Most of us are raised to believe that if you do the right things, if you carry yourself in a certain way, you don't dress a certain way, you don't drink or use substances, you come home at a certain time of night, you go out in groups, right, where you sort of like follow the line, this checklist of things that our parents and society tell us to do, that we'll be safe, that we'll be okay, that nothing bad will happen to us, right? We live in a world that tells us that bad things only happen to bad people, so that when something happens to someone, they must have done something to deserve it. And unfortunately, this is the narrative that we hear a lot of times when it comes to acts of sexual violence. What did the person who was victimized do to contribute to this happening to them, right? And there's really a lot of times a very well-meaning intent behind that. When you think about it, we say those things to make ourselves feel safe. We say those things so that we feel like we or our loved ones will be safe from this happening to them, right? Because if I can say that this other person did all of those things, right, or did something just in a certain way, went out drinking or did, whatever it is that we might judge in their behavior, we can say, if I don't do those things, if the people that I love don't do those things, then it won't happen to us, right? And so it helps us to feel safe. It addresses that discomfort and that vulnerability that we might feel when we know that it does happen. And so a lot of times too, what will happen is that the victim will be judged. They'll be judged on their character, they'll be judged on their behavior. And again, this is to help make ourselves feel immune, but it's actually counterproductive because it prevents us from getting to the root of the problem and why it's really happening, and it also denies that person who has been impacted of the support that they really need. So we can't condone this behavior. And we can't excuse it based on the behavior of the victim. And so we really need to, again, examine that and critique that and provide that support in whatever way that we can when we hear about this happening, and really hold the folks who are perpetrating it accountable. Having the conversation with our friends that say, hey, I don't like what you did. I don't like that behavior. It wasn't okay. I don't like what you said to that person. I don't like what you said to that guy or to that girl. And really sort of like having those challenging conversations that let our friends know and our peers know that this is not acceptable behavior in our schools and in our communities. The other thing that I wanted to know about consent, there was a couple of points that she noted in the video. And so the thing about consent is that you have to obtain consent for every sexual activity, right? And so just because someone wants to kiss doesn't mean they want to go to the next level, right? Just because someone consents to one sexual activity or behavior doesn't mean that they want to do everything that's kind of on your menu, right? And so you need to be having constant check-in. You need to be, again, kind of hokey, but the way that she sort of said, like, is this okay? Is this okay? Do you like this, right? Having that check-in. And the key to all of this is communication. And so you can't communicate about what's going on if someone is unconscious. If the person that you are attempting to have sex with is unconscious, or they are half asleep, or they are so incapacitated by alcohol or substances that they can't stay awake, or they're stumbling, or they're getting sick, there's not healthy communication happening about what you may want to do. She also made a point and said it's against the law to have sex with someone when you're intoxicated. The law actually specifies incapacitated because a lot of people hear intoxicated and they think sort of the classification of like 0.08, right, of intoxication. And the reality is that our physiology is different, right? So different people based on your body type, based on your age and your weight, even based on ethnicity, can process alcohol differently, right? Can metabolize alcohol differently. And so whereas one person may have 5 drinks and feel okay, like they can function, another person can have 1 drink, right, and be completely and totally obliterated. And so it really puts the onus again on us to be doing that check-in and to be making sure, because we don't always know our tolerances for alcohol and substances for our friends, right? So having that check-in and having that communication, and like I said, the law specifies incapacitated, which really puts the onus on the individuals to be doing that check-in. And first and foremost, not to take advantage of someone or not to be feeding someone drinks constantly throughout the night, not to be encouraging people to drink so that their inhibitions are lowered, and putting that responsibility on individuals to be doing that check-in and to be getting consent. And so, the last couple of points that I wanted to bring out is really about the choices that you make. The choice is yours. The point is to really think intentionally, again, about whether you want to date, whether you want to have sex, and what that looks like for you. What are your standards? What are your expectations? We all have some negotiables in terms of like how we want to be treated and how we want to be in relationships, and we have some deal breakers, right? It's like I absolutely want my relationship to involve these factors. I want to go to dinner once a week. I want to have someone who jogs with me, or whatever the case may be for you. Think about what your relationship in terms of your standards look like and how you want to be treated, and set those standards and those non-negotiables for yourself, and then communicate them to your friends. So again, when we say over and over again, the more that we communicate this, the more that people will know, and the more that they'll be able to look out for each other, and the more that you'll be able to recognize when you might be crossing someone's boundaries, right? And when that is not okay. It's like inviting someone to dinner. We communicate with our dining partners to find out what they want to eat, where they want to go, if they have any restrictions or special needs in their diet. You might ask questions because you care about them. You want them to have a good experience, and you want them to really enjoy themselves. And really, consent is just that simple, right? You ask the questions because you want the other person to be engaged, to enjoy themselves, and to make sure that part of their experience and their enjoyment really impacts yours, right? So them having a good time affects you to be able to have a good time. You don't want to take someone who's allergic to seafood out for a shrimp dinner, right? And the last part that I really want to talk about as well is a question that I get a lot of times in relation to alcohol. It's like, what if we were both drunk, right? What if both people were drunk? What if both people were under the influence? Are they assaulting each other, right? Who has the responsibility? And what we know, what we've learned, again, about how this happens, about the underlying factors of consent, is that there's always an initiator. There's always someone who is so-called like making the first move or making the next move. And sometimes that goes back and forth, right? Someone may initiate first or one act and then someone initiates taking it to the next level. But who's ever initiating the act in question, it is their responsibility to check in and to obtain that consent. And it's both person's responsibility to be doing that check-in on a regular basis, on a constant basis. And so it's important that we don't use the fact that someone has been drinking to our advantage by attempting to have sex with them, and really understanding that a lot of times this is very deliberate behavior. It's not like someone accidentally does this, right? It's not like someone does this and I didn't mean to do it, right? It's really checking in, making sure the consent is there, making sure the communication is there, and not taking advantage or using or exploiting someone. Ultimately, when we drink, we're responsible for our own actions. And so if you are drinking, if you choose to drink, not everyone does. If you run into a wall, if you fall asleep in public, if you stumble over something, that's on you, right? Those are things that may happen as a consequence of drinking, right? Or as a consequence of consuming too much, right? But you're not responsible for someone choosing to hurt you while you're drunk or because you're drunk. And this includes taking pictures of you in compromising positions, exposing you on social media, leaving you unattended somewhere, or exploiting you in any way. And I use these examples specifically because we've seen so many cases recently, especially within the last 2 years of this happening in communities, in colleges, and particularly in high schools, where this type of behavior, this type of harassment and bullying is happening, and people being in these exact positions and having pictures posted on social media, being stigmatized and isolated in schools, and it's really resulting in some extremely detrimental and destructive consequences. So as you have conversations to get acquainted and make friends, talk about what your respective beliefs and values are and expectations when it comes to sexual relationships. Validate positive behaviors and attitudes and norms amongst your friends, and challenge each other to promote healthy and respectful relationships amongst each other. Again, establish boundaries for yourself and practice communicating those boundaries with your friends and with your potential partners. Talk to your parents if you feel comfortable, right? Talk to a trusted friend or another trusted resource about this, about issues that you might be struggling with along these lines. If any of it is confusing to you, a lot of people say there's so many gray areas, there's so many things that I just don't know. Have those conversations, and as awkward as it may feel, or as weird as it may feel, it's so much better than not knowing. It's so much better than potentially harming someone else. Holding ourselves accountable to be good citizens and to treat each other well and to be good peers to each other is so important. And I just think I can't say enough when it comes to like spreading rumors or talking behind someone's back. That is one of like the biggest fears that someone could have after experiencing this, and it just really does a disservice and a dishonor to that individual and their right to privacy and respect. And it's not something that we would want anyone to do to us. So, as a recap, always model consent, respect the boundaries of yourselves and your peers and your friends. Avoid slut shaming, avoid victim blaming, avoid using derogatory terms and names that serve to judge, control, and constrict our free will. Take care of yourself and your friends and protect them from potentially harmful situations. Never, ever, ever have sex with someone who is impaired and incapacitated by alcohol or substances. Never have sex with someone who is not even use full, affirmative, active consent. And never try to manipulate or control or exploit your dating partners. Be proactive. Speak up and help out if you see anyone who might be at risk of being harmed in any way. And if someone hurts you in any way, talk to someone that you trust. Whoever that may seem like to you, and you can tell them as much or as little information that you like. A lot of times we feel like talking to a resource, talking to a counselor, talking to, someone that, even a friend, that you have to sort of like spill out all of this information, and that's really difficult to do when something has happened, because once you tell someone else the information, you can no longer sort of like protect it and control what happens to it. But telling enough information to help that person help you when you're ready is so important. You can even research There's so many resources online, so many agencies and supportive services that are devoted especially to teens and to young adults. And so there's a wealth of resources out there that can help us, guys and girls, to have these conversations and to really support each other better. So I really hope, I have this slide here, empathy binds those of us who have been vulnerable to those who may never be vulnerable. And really it just underscores the fact that whether or not we've been directly impacted or we know someone who's been impacted, most of us do, whether we realize it or not, there's really up to all of us. Each one of us has a role in making sure that our communities and our campuses, our schools are safe and healthy and supportive for ourselves and others. And so I hope that we can count on you all to do that, both here at Sacred Heart and once you all leave. I know some of you are leaving very, very soon, in a week or so I heard. And so really sort of taking those values and those core beliefs out into the world with you, and really just taking care of yourselves, taking care of each other, and making